Hey everyone, Church of STFU here. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different. I want to actually talk about my philosophical outlook on free will and what it means to me in terms of my own ethics, what I kind of draw from that. So I'm going to divide this kind of up into 3 parts, which will probably end up being different separate videos because I think they might be too long as a single video. And so the first thing I'll just be discussing free will and determinism, and what I think the outcome there is for free will as a concept that works. The second part will be discussing probably the most popular way to reconcile free will with determinism, which is compatibilism, and what I think about that. And then finally I want to discuss what ethical standards or rules or concepts I draw out of that for myself, what I think we can learn from that in terms of how we should behave ethically. So to start with, free will. Obviously free will lives or dies by our mind. It's our mind that generates our consciousness and our will, and if the mind is somehow capable of a thing we could call free will, then we have free will. If not, then we don't have free will. So what's the mind? I mean, if you want to take it down to a very basic level, and you could basically say it's a very, very, very complex biological computer. And it acts in pretty much the same way as a computer does, which is there are 3 components. There's the input, which is what we see in the world, or what we feel, what we sense, basically. So taste, sight, touch, smell, all those kind of things. They're the input into our computer, and then the output is what we do. So if we speak, if we act with our hands, or whatever other way we express ourselves or interact with the world, that's the output. And the intermediate stage, what happens between the input and the output, that's where the actual computer comes in, that drives everything. We do processing. We have memory, much like a computer, although our memory is not in fact structured, like that of a computer, but it's still memory, even though it has a different structure and different qualities to the memory that we have in our PC. And then there are processes which occur and which process the input data, and which then drive our biological machine to produce outputs in terms of our actions. And until right now, at least, we still have one major difference to computers, which is we are actually true learning machines. So we actually reprogram ourselves as we receive input. Our brain changes, unlike a computer. Basically, we have computer systems, which we call learning systems, which change some parameters in order to better accommodate future data based on past data, future inputs based on past inputs. But it's really a whole different ballgame. Those systems are really just cleverly constructed static systems, whereas the human being is a very dynamic system. The amount of reorganization our brain can do is amazing. And from basically the same raw material at birth, you can produce such a range of different people. that it's basically infinite. And just learning a simple skill involves the brain restructuring, reconfiguring neural kind of connections, and redeploying resources, which is just amazing, and which we cannot yet emulate. But in principle, from what we understand, it is a process that is actually possible to emulate, and it is a process that is quite mechanical in a way, in that we receive input and we have certain processes in our mind, which in our brain and our physiology, that actually changes the brain physically, that basically reprograms it. And the reprogramming in the case of the human brain doesn't only change the software, it also changes the hardware, which is where things get really exciting. And if we had a computer like that, that's kind of Terminator or something like that. So we are truly amazing computers. We might not be able to do 1 billion calculations a second, but we are far, far, far more advanced than the most advanced computer in pretty much all the respects that really matter when it comes to making an autonomous being that can interact with the world and learn. But all of that said, again, there's not really any point here where such a thing as free will really enters. We're presented with information in the world, our brain processes it in a certain way, and we produce an output. So in theory, according to what we know, if you could basically save the world like in a computer game, and you could load the world in exactly that state and load the brain in exactly that state, then the person, for example I, would react to the same exact input in exactly the same way every time. Now, the only possible way out of this, as far as we can scientifically tell, is things like quantum uncertainty, various effects where there might be randomness in the universe. The problem with that is, first of all, it turns out that randomness in the universe happens at a very, very low level, at a super, super subatomic level. So the law of big numbers basically means that statistically these things are not really random anymore. What your brain does, there's almost no randomness. So I have read that it is, in fact, basically by the law of large numbers, basically turns out to again be deterministic. And so my sense from that is that it's very, very rare that something happens where there's actually basically there's always a very, very huge likelihood of one outcome, and that applies to every neuron in your brain. So there's very, very few situations in which you actually do something that is in any way due to this quantum kind of uncertainty. The second point is, of course, that even if things were totally random, even if your brain used a true random number generator to come up with a variable that fed into all your decisions, that would still not be free will. That would just be randomness, which is, I guess, would make things more interesting if we in fact loaded the game again and again and replayed it. But in terms of free will, it really does nothing for us. So there's no hope in quantum theory or any other idea of randomness that can save free will. And that is basically my take on free will. I think we are in fact a very, very powerful biological computer, but the universe is essentially either completely deterministic or largely deterministic with an element of randomness. So if you look at a single human being and just look at it throughout its lifetime, then what the human being breaks down to is a vast kind of huge series of environmental inputs that produce outputs and the processes that change the brain. But you get from one to the next, and there's no free will anywhere in that equation. It's all a deterministic chain. So a human being is really a biological computer, or you could see it as a process through time, a learning process, a series of experiences. But the experiences are driven by two things: the biological hardware and the experiences we're having right now. And the biological hardware is changed by the experiences we had in the past. So we're really a sum of what we were born with and all of the experiences we've had. And that really allows no room for free will, as far as I'm concerned, because really we're the sum of these things. There is no little person that sits there and has any input on that. And basically I think it is due to this crazy phenomenon of consciousness, which I may touch on later, or may actually have another video on entirely, that kind of makes it hard to accept that we are really just this sequence of events and biological hardware that interact. But to me, at least, unless someone has some other argument on that, that is what we seem to be. This is, I think, so far mostly a view that is kind of accepted by the mainstream, at least in as far as the universe is either deterministic or has some elements of randomness. But randomness and determinism both aren't choice, obviously. So those things don't generate free will. And I think that the neural sciences, the greater understanding of our brain, is leading us more and more to actually understand these various processes, much like we would understand a computer program by looking at its source code. And again, the brain is much more complex, and we are nowhere near really understanding the source code of the human being, especially when the source code is not just software, but an interplay between software and reconfiguring hardware. Really amazing. But in essence, we can understand this. We can gain a complete understanding of this one day, and then we would really have all of the parts of a human being pinned down, and barring randomness, given a very, very powerful computational power, we could actually predict exactly what a human being would do if we present it with a certain input once we have that understanding, which scientifically right now seems like it should be possible eventually, or at least in theory possible, unless we find some kind of impediment to developing computers powerful enough. But this should be possible. So we should actually come to a situation where we can predict with perfect accuracy, or perhaps imperfect accuracy due to some element of randomness, but not choice, what a human being will do given an input. So human beings are either determined and deterministic, or there's an element of randomness, neither of which is free will. Alright, so this is it for my part 1, which was about determinism and free will. And my next video, which I will upload right now, will be on my position towards compatibilism, which is in fact a way of trying to reconcile the two concepts of having free will, even though one believes the universe is determined. And thanks for struggling through all that. Hopefully at some point in the future I will add some pictures and things to that. But again, my condolences for coming this far. If you haven't had enough punishment yet, go for the next video. Do it. You know, if you watch all 3 or 4 or however many it'll turn out to be, you're definitely gonna get a Boy Scout medal. But if you don't, then I'll see you guys later. Church of SDF.